Hello, my name is Dr. Jim Doty, and I'm the host of the Into the Magic Shop podcast, where we explore the mysteries of the brain and the secrets of the heart. Hi, this is Dr. Jim Doty, host of the Into the Magic Shop podcast. My guest today is Tamsin Woolley-Barker, an internationally known evolutionary anthropologist whose early work on social structure and speciation in wild baboons led to a greater understanding of the role of hybridization in the evolution of primates like us. She received her PhD in biological anthropology from the New York Consortium for Evolutionary Primatology, and also received the first master's degree in biomimicry at Arizona State University. She's the director and founder of the Borrego Institute for Living Design, as well as the dean for biocultural leadership at Geoversity Foundation. Her aim has been to catalyze a widespread shift from mechanistic thinking to what she calls living design, so we can collectively align with the ecological and evolutionary processes governing living things. She is the best-selling author of Teaming: How Nature's Oldest Teams Adapt and Thrive. This is regarded as the defining work in organizational biomimicry. I hope you enjoy. Well, Tamsin, it's wonderful to be with you today, and actually I'm quite honored. You have quite an extraordinary career. If I were to summarize it, and tell me if I'm incorrect, and that's okay too, but fundamentally the question is, how does nature do it? And I think you focused your whole life on this, especially in the field of biomimicry. And but what I'd like to start with is, tell me about your relationship with baboons.
Oh, yeah, I'm an evolutionary biologist by training. So I spent my earlier career in Ethiopia studying these two different kinds of baboons. And they were really different in their social system, but they hybridized in this whole zone, like a 25-mile zone. And so I was studying the way that speciation actually occurs through personal behavior, individual behavior. And now I apply that to my work.
Well, and that's what interests me is maybe you can explain for the listeners what hybridization actually is in the context of speciation.
Right, because early on we thought these baboons were different species, and the definition of a species is that they cannot interbreed and produce fertile young, but these baboons were, and what we found was that genes were crossing all over the place, and so we created a model for what human evolution would look like if this was true for us as well. So now we have the Neanderthal introgression, we know about that. And we know about the other species of humans that were interbreeding at that time as well.
So, in simple terms, perhaps for myself, as much as the listeners, what does all of that mean?
Yes. Well, different species that come together and they are mating. And so they shouldn't be able to mate according to our traditional species hypotheses. But they do, and when they do, some of those genes get through, and so we have Neanderthal genes within us, and this really changed our understanding of human evolution.
Speaking of Neanderthals, tell me, because it was initially thought that they were quite primitive, or their brains did not meet the match of the human brain. But I think that whole interpretation has completely changed now.
Absolutely. I mean, I think of them as humans just as much as we are. They were clearly very artistic, and they buried their dead, very, religious type of people, spiritual. And we know they were fantastic hunters and craftsmen, and I think we can be proud to call them our relatives.
Yes. But on that note, though, why did our relatives die out and we survive?
Well, some of them live on within us, right? Some of their genes. Well,
that's true.
Within us. But, we don't really know. It could be that they had a slower lifestyle. It just didn't breed as fast. Or it could be that the conditions weren't favorable to them. I don't think it was our intelligence. I think it was just the conditions were suitable for us.
So, when I mentioned when we started this idea of how would nature do it, it seems as though you've really been focusing this mindset shift from mechanistic thinking to, I think, what you call living design. Can you explain that a little bit more so that our listeners really understand what you're focused on and really fundamentally how important that is?
Yeah, well, when I got out of evolutionary biology, and when I went back into the workforce, I was in a corporate environment, and I noticed the same kinds of behaviors that the baboons had in the CEOs and the executives. And so I started thinking, well, how can I apply this to what I see in corporate life and actually organizational life in general? And so I started looking at, I look at us as another animal, just another animal. So what is the nature of this human being? And then when we say, how does nature do it? We are nature. And so I think that is the fundamental shift that we need to make, is that it's not humans and animals, it is just life.
On that note, though, why does it seem that we have such difficulty interacting as a species in terms of violence, hate, lack of cooperation? Certainly, I know that in environments where there is plenty, that seems to cut that down, but it's in the context of scarcity or perceived scarcity. Maybe you can give us your thoughts on that.
I mean, I know we definitely have the capacity for us and them. We're very group focused, tribal focused, and so it's easy for us to dehumanize others. That's part of our species makeup. But if you look at foraging people, they live very peacefully with one another, and they have extensive rules for that, and they don't tolerate greed or lying and those kinds of things. So I think for us, we need to go back and see what has happened to our societies that have actually damaged our fundamental human nature.
Well, I can't remember. Is it called Dunbarton's number? This number where, if you exceed, 150 or so, that you have this sort of breakdown. And is that because you sort of can't keep track of that many people, and that leads to cheating, if you will, or not acting with the intention of supporting the group, but more yourself?
Yeah, that's Robin Dunbar's work, and we actually shared a field site, and we worked on some of the same baboons. But what he noticed was that these gelada baboons were gathering in huge societies, much bigger than other primates. And he also noticed that they spent a lot of time grooming each other and actually talking. They're actually always singing and making noise to each other. And so what he did was he's found that that brain size in primates correlates with group size, and it correlates with the amount of time they groom each other. So you see, if you were a Martian zoologist and you came across a human being and you shot it with your ketamine blow dart and measured our brain, you would think that we live in groups of about 150 people, which actually turns out to be true. If you look in military groups, used to be the number of Christmas cards that British people sent each other was around 150. So you see this kind of natural group size for us. It's an average. But what it happens to be related to is the amount of time that we can spend relating to each other and forming really strong bonds. And so it's related exactly to what you're saying, trust, and then the way you can keep track of trust in your fellow humans.
So as we evolved, if you will, from the hunter-gatherer tribes to society, would you ascribe that to one of the challenges in terms of us living peacefully, and because we don't have the time, if you will, to connect with so many people, and then that leads to this mentality of us versus them sometimes?
Well, I think we just can't know each other, and so we can't build the trust. We're in these global societies where, we don't know each other. And so how can we have the trust that we need to share a purpose and to do things that we really need to do? I mean, I look at, climate change and these really big problems that we need to solve. We have all the answers. We know how to do it, but we can't do it because we don't have the trust. And the reason we don't have the trust is because our groups are too big and all of our, tribal trust bonds that are, related to a place, a specific place and living there, those have all been damaged and broken, slavery and migration. We've lost those connections. So I think it's related to that.
Well, so interestingly enough, if you look back in history and you look at the work of, what's his name? Is it Boatner? The Blue Zones. How does that interface with this then? You look back at those societies that are left who have increased longevity. Is that a manifestation of sort of this disruption of our natural way of being?
Yeah, I mean, you see, so I look at ant colonies and they have this kind of developmental arc and then, they die out, they bud out. That's just a process of the species. And we have the same kind of process. So when you look at, human civilizations, they have this like 2,000-year arc. And I think we're just coming to the end of our 2,000 years.
Oh, well,
giant things just kind of crumble into tribes and the whole thing starts again.
Is that an optimistic viewpoint or not?
I don't know. I just I look to the ants.
Well, it's interesting though because you comment on this, but you wrote this book, Teeming: How Superorganisms Work to Build Infinite Wealth in a Finite World. But in theory, you're creating a unified theory of what organizations must do to scale exponentially. But it sounds like fundamentally, at the end of the day, that's not really possible. Or am I misunderstanding something?
I don't know. I mean, we're not really socially. We're very flexible. We can do all kinds of things. We can live in these global societies. We can live in little tribes. So we're very flexible that way. But I think that when organizations are trying to scale, they do it by trying to control it, control the diversity, control it, standardize. Even from the youngest age, we're competing for grades and then salaries and these kinds of things. But that's not how human societies work traditionally. We help each other, we develop each other, and collectively we can do all the things. So I see organizations shifting to these collective intelligence models and swarm creativity models and distributed leadership and these things that allow organizations to scale, but still maintaining that kind of structure that we can maintain trust and collaboration with.
So could you maybe give an example of a corporate environment, if that's possible, that you've worked with and describe sort of the pre-intervention manner in which they behave versus the post-intervention manner and how that changed things, and what was the ultimate ROI on that shift?
Oh my goodness, what a question. Well, I can't give you one of my companies, but I can give you an example. Buurtzorg, which is a Dutch healthcare company. So they're providing healthcare to people in neighborhoods, whereas before they would impose this global standard, and then they would be sending the nurses out all over the place. And then they switched to this neighborhood model that the nurses and the patients all know each other, and they actually run the whole operation in little teams. So it's self-organizing, it's local, it is small and trust-based, and it's gone through the roof. It's a model that has just changed healthcare in the Netherlands. And there's other companies that are using that kind of model too. In manufacturing, it works very well. And so I think it's something that companies are traditionally trying to implement best practices and quality control. and actually manage diversity, really suppress it. Whereas in, flexible societies, it's all based on self-organization and trust and shared purpose. So I think we can move to those kind of models.
Well, it's interesting if you look at the history of, the World Monetary Fund, how they would go to countries and without necessarily consulting the people who were having a problem, they impose their will based on the assessment of their consultants without input from the local people, and which repeatedly was a disaster, I think.
Oh, sure. I work with Geoversity, and that's a school in Panama. And it was founded by Nathan Gray, who was the director of Oxfam America. And when they were working in Guatemala, they externally imposed these zinc roofs, metal roofs, and they just became these flying helicopter decapitation things. Whereas the local people were like, no, no, no. But so we don't ask. And it's the way we do everything, really.
Well, and I think that's really a key point is one, to have respect for the people we're working with and understand that oftentimes the thousands of years of traditions that they have are there for a reason, because experientially they know it a lot better than somebody just walking in thinking that through their if you want to call it modern training, they have greater insights than the people on the ground, obviously.
Sure. I mean, we've been in a project we've been doing in Kauai with Seeding Change. We're helping to restore the traditional ahupua'as, and that's the way they would manage the water from the mountain to the sea so that they could support their people. And so now they're restoring that, and it's giving them food security, and it's also restoring those traditions that, give the kids identity, and hope.
Well, maybe we can talk about that a little bit too. Fundamentally, what we're talking about is knowledge of indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
And how through their own evolution, if you will, they have managed to integrate into nature and survive and thrive based on their understanding of nature.
Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't even see integrate. I would say that we always were. So it's emergent. It's emerging from a place and the nature of a place. And I think that if we can restore that kind of worldview of relating to all our relatives in a place, of any species, it's going to change. And the key word, like you said, is respect.
Well, I study compassion, but fundamentally it all comes down to creating an environment of psychological safety and trust and respect and recognizing everyone's dignity and not having a perception that you are superior than anyone else. And I think that's one of the challenges. I think if you look at the evolution of how humans have acted, unfortunately, there have been groups, primarily in Europe, who decided to go to other countries and impose their view of what they felt there was their superior perspective, and seemingly it's created disaster all over the world at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. And I expand that. For me, I mean, this living design is really about understanding that every living thing has evolved and survived since, the beginning of time. So all of us are equal survivors with our own magic for doing that. And I think we forget that.
So how would you how would you define living design in the context of your work and what that means practically?
Well, I mean, like I say, I see everywhere we're designing our world with this mechanistic thinking. And, I think, we look at these linear charts of doom and gloom, and life's not like that. It's a complex adaptive system. It can turn on a dime. So I living design is understanding that, and also understanding that the specifics of a life emerge from a place, emerge from a water source or a story or a people, and all of the individuals that live there, all different species. So living design is coming at things from that way and studying the way that life already is there and then aligning with it rather than imposing our will.
So how do indigenous peoples who obviously have been here a very long time, how do we integrate the modern world into the lessons that we can learn from indigenous peoples?
Yeah, and that's a huge question. I mean, right now we know that 80% of the world's biodiversity is managed by those 5% of the people who are indigenous. And so I think we're coming to a time where we need to learn how to, manage the lands that we live in a way that increases the potential for evolution in the future. And so that's increasing diversity. Diversity is the raw feedstock of that possibility. So I think thinking that way changes everything. So I think that's the number one thing that indigenous people can teach us is that living mindset and getting away from that mechanistic thinking. Again, respect and humility.
Well, on that note, let's talk about the lack of that in modern Western capitalistic society and how that interferes with our ability to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, capitalism is really all about extraction. And, all animals do that. You have to feed yourself and all that. So, that's standard, but we're doing it in a way that depletes the future evolutionary potential. We're suppressing diversity, suppressing individuals. And so in traditional societies, we would be observing each other and saying, wow, that person has an amazing talent. Let's develop them for the tribe. And so we would be doing that for each other, but we don't because we're competing for grades, or then we're competing for salaries, we're competing for promotions. And I think that's a fundamental shift that we can learn from indigenous people.
Well, obviously, in theory, that's true, but how do you practically implement that or make that into a value proposition which people buy into?
Right.
I would say that, unfortunately, and I think, especially in the context of people, in fact, indigenous people sometimes who buy the narrative of extractive capitalism, believing that narrative, which includes a definition that success relates to power, position, money, leads to happiness. And as you well know, nothing could be more wrong than that narrative. Yet, so many people from third world countries come here and, frankly, I think are extraordinarily disappointed. Yet this continues. And we continue also to get ever-increasing power differential or income inequality, which leads to ever-increasing suffering by the poor, or frankly, the people with whom their talents or abilities or productivity are being extracted.
Yeah. Well, I think increasingly we're going to see that the value proposition demands it because we can't, with the climate change and with refugee crises and war and poverty and all these things, it creates a lot of instability. And so I think we're going to see that more and more organizations want to shift the way they work so that they can be more flexible, more purpose-oriented, and actually switch to regenerative models where we are growing community potential. And then people don't need to leave home. They can grow the possibility where they are.
Well, I think that is ideally, or would ideally be the case. I think as an example, I was with the King of Bhutan recently, and we were talking about the fact that prior to TVs being introduced, the culture did not have a perception of what was happening outside of Bhutan. And frankly, they were, it's a very poor country. People survived, and they had a very strong family culture. And then with the introduction of TV, which gives them frankly, a false view of the value proposition of capitalism, it's resulted in about 10% of the young or 10% of the population, primarily young, leaving the country and not returning.
Yeah, and that's something you see. Indigenous elders are always complaining about that. The kids find out about all the good stuff and off they go. But like in the San hunter-gatherers, they saw that happening in the 60s and 70s. But by the 90s, those children had actually come back. And they had been disappointed, like you say, and they'd come back. But luckily for them, that happened in the space of a generation or two. And so they didn't lose their knowledge, their biocultural knowledge, the stories and all of that. But, in Native American groups, you see a lot of that biocultural knowledge is gone forever. So it's, we really are in a position of having to actually regenerate the knowledge. And so I think it's, we've got to teach people to see and about those ecological relationships and the way that change occurs and all those things.
Well, I think, unfortunately, the nature of colonialist behavior was intentionally to destroy the culture that was indigenous to that area, to, at least I think in their belief system, to teach them about a better way, which obviously was quite wrong.
Yeah.
And you did lose all of this knowledge.
Right.
And I think one of the reasons people leave also is they get into their head that their culture or the situation they're in is actually inferior. And if they leave, they'll sort of be in the modern world. But I think, as you well know, the modern world is not the best place to be.
Well, in Geoversity, we work with the Kuna people, and they have a semi-autonomous territory. But now they're seeing, their island communities are going underwater because of climate change. So they've had this whole phenomenon of the youth leaving, like you say, because they want the fancy clothes, they want all the stuff. And then now, there's a rising demand for that, for the culture and to protect the elders. And so we're seeing that swing back. And I suspect that we're going to see that more generally. Even in America, people that have been removed from their home cultures and the old country for so long are craving it. They're craving that back to nature and to know the places they live.
Well, tell me a little bit more about Geoversity and some of the work you're doing there and in Borrego Springs and other places in terms of what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, well, so I started working with Geoversity maybe 4 years ago, and it's in Panama. It's a 30-year organization, and it's based on, it's really conservation. But over time, it's become apparent that the working with indigenous populations is the best way to do conservation. So it's based on that. And it's based on sharing, facilitating communication between indigenous groups, campesinos, the government. Regenerative tourism is emerging, and developmental leadership. So teaching English and that kind of thing. But what recently came out of it was this incredible film, The Endangered Generation, which is an Australian film by Celeste Gear. She won it at Cannes some years ago. And so she follows a climate activist, Agar Tejada, and myself down this river in Panama So we're crossing the Americas, really, and we're talking to the chiefs about climate change and what could be done and what's happening. So that was just amazing, and that's actually debuting now. So that was amazing, and so we showed that in the Kuna territory, and then they're making the mola sail. You might have seen this at COP26, that sail that they made, and the women came together and sewed this traditional sail that is really related to their island communities going under for climate change and providing hopeful models for other Indigenous groups to reclaim their power in the face of climate change.
Well, one of the interesting things that I found is that Indigenous peoples are now coming together as a group to impart their knowledge and also express their concern and offer that knowledge to help us move forward in this modern world. Do you have any comments on that?
It's really inspiring, and you saw it at Standing Rock. Indigenous peoples from all over the world coming together to support, water protection, and then Mauna Kea as well. Just a huge uprising of land source knowledge and wisdom, and so I think that's really inspiring for all those communities, but also for everyone watching.
A friend of mine actually was, I don't know if the right word is, inducted into this Council of the Eagle and the Condor. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, with Phil Lane, hereditary.
Yes.
Lane.
Yes. I know Phil. My friend, he's from actually the UK. His name is Stephen Vasconcelos Sharp. I don't know if you have run across him. He and I have worked together on some projects related to compassion, as well as, if you want to call it, reimagining the future in terms of getting back to some of these things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's really exciting, the work that Phil is doing, and the Compassion Games, if you know John Raymer. And he's actually been going to different cities and creating competitions of kindness. So that's inspiring. But the two of them work together closely, and it is a radical collaboration between worldviews. And so I think that's the way of the future. I love it.
Well, no, I think that term is actually correct. I have known John a long time, and it's interesting just to comment on that. When they started the Compassion Games, if I recall correctly, it was initially between Louisville and, was it Seattle?
Yeah.
And I think to really give emphasis to this idea of compassion, the mayor of Louisville actually flew to Seattle to assist them beating Louisville.
It's perfect.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. And John is really doing John and Phil working together are doing amazing things, creating these deep transformational networks where we can do change. And that's that One World community. I don't know if you know that one, but we're actually putting teaming into the DNA of that.
Well, tell me a little bit more about One World. It's interesting. I was just in Belfast, and there's One Young World, which is a group of youth activists, but I'm sure it's separate from One World.
Well, One World is an amorphous thing. I haven't quite grasped this organism yet, but it's big and sprawling, and everyone's dedicated to peace, world peace. And so what we did this summer was this 99 days of radical collaboration for that community, where we invited everyone to declare a purpose, a mission, and we had a structure for that mirrored living systems, this nested, interconnected structure. And then we took it through levels of paradigm so that it would reveal these differences in worldview so that we could radically collaborate. And then we went into process, evolutionary processes, ecological processes, and really deep stuff, and then people in place. And so it really was a radical collaboration between all kinds of indigenous groups and the One World community. And it was amazing to see the missions develop. And we'll do that next year as well.
Oh, wonderful. Well, let's talk a little bit more about sort of what is it that is the most important thing on your agenda, or what is it, if you sort of call what you're doing, what is the thing that you would call success in your efforts?
Yeah, well, for me, when I'm driving around, I'm a plant geek, and so I'm looking at the plants and ecology, and it just really kills me to see the simplification of the land, the monocrops and the big box stores and the just golf courses and that. So success to me looks like restoring complexity and diversity. But to do that, I mean, I'm working with the organizations, with companies, with, where they're ready to work, which is teams and the processes of teamwork. But then I think the most important thing is actually learning to see diversity and learning to see these relationships. So if I can get people out to this ranch, it's a 86-acre ranch out in Borrego Springs, and, helping them see, draw, track, bushcraft, storytelling, traditional arts. We're looking at stars. It's an international dark sky community. So my big project right now is building this campground and welcoming people to come learn.
Well, it's sort of interesting because you're talking about monoculture, and I'm sure you appreciate that diversity is not profitable. And what I mean by that is it's not scalable, while if you have a monoculture that is scalable. And obviously, the bottom line with this is profit, even at the expense of the health of the people who are consuming these products.
Right. No, that's absolutely the case. And that's what we see with the organizations as well. The more you can simplify and standardize with best practices and all that, then you can scale. And that's what we're trying to do all the time, right? So that we have to put less effort in. But, like you say, it comes at the expense of future possibility and resilience and even just our collective intelligence. So I think there is a business proposition to be made for that. And but it's aligning, look at quarterly profits. How are you going to do something in a quarter?
Well, of course, that's the problem with the stock market and having shareholders who demand results. And unfortunately, it's also a manifestation of the fact that, the average lifespan of a CEO is about 5 years. And the type of people who become CEOs oftentimes are ones who want to extract for themselves the greatest amount of profit. So they aim at a timeline of 5 years. And the entire time, they're manipulating the corporation so that it benefits them at the end of the day without necessarily having a long-term view of the ultimate cost of that behavior.
Yeah. I mean, I think long-term, we're going to have to, if we're going to stick with capitalism, we're going to have to reinvent it so that it grows communities and grows ecosystems.
Yeah. And
I don't know how.
Well, but that's... I think people are looking for that answers. How do you do that? Because, if we look at the various alternatives, capitalism, and I would put in the context of regulated capitalism, meaning that governments, as much as some corporate entities dislike regulation, that is the only way you can have fair capitalism, versus this notion that we should decrease the size of government and allow corporations to do whatever they wish, with them promising with their fingers crossed that they're going to do the right thing.
Yeah. I mean, big changes have to be made. And I think it probably comes down to private ownership and models of that, because it just kills me when I'm driving down the road. I can't even do anything about some land that's behind someone's fence, and yet that's the land that we all depend on. All the animals depend on that. So something's got to give.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because probably almost anywhere you travel, which is a rural area, you see hundreds of thousands of acres and they're fenced. But I always wonder who owns those.
Yeah. And I mean, it just makes me crazy. And so I found that a lot of that land is owned by the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management. And so that's us, right? We own it. And those lands are destroyed. They're just mowed to one species. And so we have that power, I think, to reclaim that.
Well, or we have the possibility to reclaim it. I don't know if we have the power yet to reclaim it. Because, of course, you have these formidable forces. As an example, I mean, I'm sure you're aware that a lot of the BLM land has been leased to corporate entities, as an example, to feed cattle, right?
Of course. I mean, that's what you see is the cattle mowing it all down. And it's an extractive model. We've applied to our federal lands. And we take it for granted now, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Well, no, that's exactly right. I mean, if you look at the cost of feeding a cow and the water, it's massive compared to, as an example, growing crops, right?
Right.
Comparatively. Unfortunately, I think that we have been sold into believing that we need to eat a lot of beef or other meat. And then this gets back to what you're talking about, monoculture, where whether it's beef, whether it's chickens or other types of farm animals, we've industrialized that.
Yeah.
To the negative benefit, not only of the animals, of course, but to us humans as well.
Yeah, the other animal.
Yes, right.
Yeah, bring back the buffalo. What if we did that?
Well, that's sort of funny, because I'm sure you've seen those photographs where people are walking up to the buffalo somehow thinking they're pets, and it's sort of a frightening thing.
Perfect example of the work I'm trying to do. If we can get people to open their eyes and understand life and the way it works, and have humility and respect for it, all life, I think we wouldn't be in the situation we're in.
So how do we get people, though, do you think, to recognize that they're part of a whole, that without respect for the whole, respect for other species, respect for the land, ultimately respect for the planet, that we will all perish? And as you know, if you look at the planetary boundaries, we've exceeded a number of these. So where do we go from here? And will it take ultimately a massive crisis? I mean, we already look at how weather has changed, and these parts of the world that are going to increase their temperature significantly, that will make them ultimately uninhabitable. And there are millions of people in these areas.
Right. I think we're going about it in the wrong way. The focus has been on curbing emissions, recycling, and these kinds of things. But really, I think if we were to shift to doing away from sustainability and more in towards growing potential, growing diversity, and learning about the land that you live on and the species there and how the interactions, the relationships. And I think you already see this in schools. I see that with my kids, that the focus is very biological, ecological, whereas it was not when I was younger. So I think it comes from that, learning how to restore the water in your community. It starts there.
Well, if we look at, though, what has happened, and probably in most countries, we've taken individuals who were in rural areas, and through the industrialization of farming or growing or animal production, which can be done by a very small number of people through the mechanization of it. And this has pushed so many people into major cities, which is the thing that separates them from nature. How do you reverse that?
Well, it's really interesting because that move to the cities is the key event that drops in the number of children you decide to have. So it does have the effect of reducing overpopulation. But like you say, it also severs people from that connection and from their cultural memory. And so I think, once that stuff is lost, it's very difficult to get back languages and all the knowledge that we have. But I think it's going to take a concerted effort to remember that old knowledge and save it.
Do you think that's going to take suffering by a lot of people to get people's attention at the end of the day?
Well, I think people are going to suffer, yeah. I think there's going to be a lot of death and destruction. I do. But I also think that we have the answers and that we'll do what we need to do. People have always been so flexible. Even our species, might have been down to, I think it was 1,500 individuals at one point in our history. And so we're nothing if not flexible and persistent.
Well, and, perhaps that maybe what at the end of the day it takes is a mass die-off. I mean, if you look at the oceans right now, where there's the potential extinction of a lot of species, where there will be collapse of the oceans. At the end of the day, if there are no foodstuff, we're going to have a serious problem here. And so in terms of your own work, what would you like to see in terms of sort of your lasting legacy as far as the work that you've done? Is it related to organizational change in the modern world? Is it related to your understanding or knowledge of biomimicry? Is it related to perhaps training or giving insight to younger people?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the youth are always the key. I'd like to think that I could leave a legacy of opening eyes and changing minds. That if people could just actually see the miracle that's all around us, I would consider that a good legacy. But from that, can we learn those processes and start designing our lives that way? We know we have the capability because we did it before. And so I would like to see that.
But, as you indicated, though, cultures seem to last about 2,000 years or so, and then they collapse.
Civilizations.
Well, okay, we'll call it civilizations.
Yeah.
And what are we calling our civilization right now? Is that confined to the Americas? Is it Europe? What is the civilization then that you were alluding to?
I think it's the Romans still. This is the last dying gasp of the Roman Empire.
I see. I see. Maybe as we close, you can maybe give us 3 insights that all of us could benefit from in terms of improving the world, not only for ourselves, but the future generations.
Yep. Well, I'd say, study the world around you, study the flows, study the way that life actually works, and then try to design your systems and processes around that rather than imposing it. That would be 1. 2 would be, I think it's really important to understand the nature of this human animal, that we're not like chimpanzees. We're not competitors. We are more like superorganisms like ants and bees, and we help and share. And can we design our world to bring out the best in our species?
And 3?
3, well, I want people to reconnect to land, the places that they live, and learn about the place and the stories, the source, the water sources, the way that the land is actually trying to be and enhance them.
Well, I agree. If people take a little bit more time also, I think, to connect with others and recognize that oftentimes what seems to separate is actually fear of people who have anxiety about how they are in this world because they don't have the support systems that they traditionally had, yet everyone wants to connect. And so creating that environment of safety and trust, at the end of the day, I think will have a profound impact on whether our species survives.
I think you're right. I mean, I think that inclusive, welcoming, belonging as you are is the root of the whole thing.
That is true. I agree with you. Well, listen, thanks so much, Tamsin, for being with us today. I really appreciate it. I'll be doing actually a little introduction to give a little bit more details about you and your work. And I hope our paths interact again, or cross again, or interact, or whatever the word's supposed to be.
Until we meet again. Well, thank
Yes.
you. This has been a real pleasure.
Well, listen, you take care.
You too.
Again, thank you for being with us today. The Into the Magic Shop podcast can be found where you find your most popular podcasts, or you can find us at intothemagicshop.com.